Hello, and thank you for joining us today in our studies of 2 Samuel. Today we're in 2 Samuel chapter 14, and we're in this continuing saga of David and Absalom as it's going to take place here in this chapter. And really it goes all the way back to David and the promises that were made to him that there would forever be turmoil in his house because of his sin with Bathsheba. We've seen it with the actions of Amnon. We have then seen it in the revenge of Absalom on Amnon. And now we're going to see how that relationship continues between David and Absalom. Remember at the end of chapter 13, Absalom is going to be sent into exile, or he's going to flee into exile. And so now as we come into chapter 14, there's going to be this time period that has passed. The period of mourning over Amnon's death has passed, and all of those things have come to their time. And so as we start in chapter 14, we see the beginning of the attempts to put things back together in David's family. And it's actually going to start not from David himself, but from David's cousin, Joab, who is the commander of the army. Notice at the beginning of chapter 14, it's stated in verse 1 that Joab knows the heart of the king being concerned about Absalom. Joab knows that David has been worrying about Absalom, that he's been thinking about what has transpired and things of that nature. And so Joab is going to put together a little ploy to try to bring things into the spotlight with David. He's going to go to this woman from Tekoa. And he is going to, in essence, hire her to come and to bring this story before the king, knowing that David will be touched by this story, knowing that David will be open to this story because of who it's coming from and what the situation is. But she comes bringing this story about having one son that killed another son and asking for David's help to keep from having lost another son in all of this because of the revenger of blood. And those are principles that go back into the Old Testament law. If there was somebody who was killed, then there could be an avenger or a revenger of blood for the family who could bring about the consequences for that death by putting to death the person who committed those things, and could do so absent from a continuing progression of the law. In other words, the person that the avenger of blood, or the family of the avenger of blood's killer, could not then go after the avenger of blood, and so on and so forth. But she brings this message to David, and David is prepared to listen to her, and he does listen to her, and he follows through with questioning her about the things that have happened. And then as the conversation goes on and we get about to the halfway point of the chapter, something clicks in David's mind. And David is going to ask, he says, "What was it Joab who asked you to do these things? Was Joab feeding you all of this information?" And she is going to admit that yes, it was Joab who told her what to say and who brought all of these things before him. Now, you could see David possibly getting angry, because there's a sense in which Joab has tried to trick him or has tried to fool him into these things. But David doesn't become angry, and he doesn't take it out on Joab, and he doesn't take it out on the woman of Tekoa. But instead he sees the point that Joab was trying to make. And he is going to give Joab the ability and the clearance to bring back Absalom from his exile. And so Joab is going to go, and he is going to arrange for Absalom's return. But when he does, David is going to tell Joab that Absalom can only go to his own house. He is not allowed to see David's face. Here we see the depth of David's emotions for his own children, because we're going to see his emotions for Absalom that are going to come out again even later in the book. But David, while he is allowing Absalom to return, is not forgiving Absalom necessarily for what he has done. Now, if you go back into chapter 13 and you see all of the things that transpired in that chapter, you see how David did not take care of the situation, even though he was angry about what happened. He didn't take care of the situation with Amnon, and it went on for years without any change, just sweeping things under the rug. And then Absalom decides to take matters into his own hand. Now David is angry with Absalom, and David is not able or not willing to see Absalom because he took matters into his own hands, and because he took his brother, put his brother to death for his crimes. But David is not yet willing to concede that he did wrong in not taking care of the issue, and is still blaming Absalom for what he has done. So there's not forgiveness here. There has simply been the allowance for Absalom to return. And then you're going to have in all of this principle in David's silence, where for 2 years, David and Absalom are going to live in the same city, and they're never going to see each other, and they're never going to speak to one another over the course of 2 years. And it's even going to be to the point where Absalom is going to try to touch base with Joab and to get Joab to go and talk to David. But as we might say in our day and time, Joab's not returning his calls either. Joab's not answering Absalom, and he's not receiving the messengers. Absalom is finally going to go to the point of burning down one of the fields of Joab to get his attention and force him to respond. And then it is going to be the case that Joab is going to facilitate a face-to-face meeting between David and Absalom. This family is quite dysfunctional at this point. They're not talking to one another. They're not working together. They're not going the same way. They're not repenting. They're not apologizing for things that have been done. They're not forgiving one another for things that have been done. All of these things are continuing to stew. They are continuing to be under the surface of everything that happens for years now. And it's not going to necessarily end with what happens in chapter 13. As a matter of fact, over the course of the next few years, it's only going to escalate further. David is often talked about as a man after God's own heart, and he's talked about as a good and great king, and both of those things he was, but David was by no means perfect. David here is going to have some very difficult times because he does not handle his relationship with his children properly. He doesn't handle things according to the standards that are expected. And so when we come back next time, we'll begin looking at chapter 15. Because we're seeing the breakdown in communication and the problems with sin entering in and not being disposed of in the proper way. And we need to see the way that people's choices and people's bad choices, whether it comes from the parent, whether it comes from the children. And remember, Absalom's a grown man at this point. He's not a little kid. But that all of these things have ramifications, they have consequences, they cause hurt, they cause shame, and they truly bring down this entire family in the things that are going to come next. And we're going to see that play out in chapter 15. Thank you for joining us in our study today, and I hope that you'll come back and join us next time. But until then, have a great day.